Hey, are you hungry? Well, you're in luck. Meat and Three is back for season 16. I'm Taylor Early, and we've got a whole new batch of reporters I am so excited to introduce you to.
Hi, there. I'm Elizabeth Fisher.
Asha McElroy.
Sam Girardi.
Jessica Gingrich.
Hannah from Wisconsin.
I'm a swing dancing audio engineer.
I am a future registered dietitian nutritionist.
I'm from New York, and I love rice and beans.
My favorite food of all time is a shrimp burrito.
I love watermelon.
We've also got a bonus podcast for you called Behind the Internship. 3 of our reporters will take you along to show how they developed stories for this very show, Meat and Three.
Hi, I'm Danielle Flitter, a plant-based chef from Philadelphia, living in Mexico City.
I'm Sophia Hooper. I'm a bartender based in Portland, Maine.
My name is Addison Austin Liu. I am a chef and food journalist from Salt Lake City, Utah, and my favorite food is Peruvian.
Rice and beans.
Hand-drawn noodle soup.
So tune in to enjoy a square meal for your ears. And I hope you saved a little room for dessert. You're listening to Heritage Radio Network.
HRN is food radio supported by you. Learn more at heritageradionetwork.org.
This episode is brought to you by the second annual Catskill Cuisine Festival. Visit catskill-cuisine.com to learn more and buy tickets.
Welcome to Inside Julia's Kitchen, the podcast of the Julia Child Foundation for Gastronomy and the Culinary Arts. I'm your host, Todd Shulkin, the Foundation's Executive Director. Our show takes you inside the Foundation's world to meet the talented people we have the great fortune of learning from all the time. On today's show, we welcome food writer Hannah Che. In this episode, we'll talk to Hannah about Chinese cooking, her IACP Julia Child award-winning cookbook, The Vegan Chinese Kitchen, and we'll hear Hannah's Julia moment. Stay with us. We'll be right back. As always, we launch the conversation with an inspiration from Julia. You may have heard that Julia's favorite cuisine besides French food was Chinese. This is true. It was one of the first foreign cuisines Julia was exposed to after leaving Southern California to serve her country during World War II. After initially being posted to Ceylon, modern-day Sri Lanka, and meeting her husband-to-be, Paul Child, they were transferred by the Office of Strategic Services, the precursor to today's CIA, to its key posts in China. While briefly in what was Chongqing, Julia and Paul finished out the last 6 months of their duties before the war ended in Kunming, where they both worked in military intelligence, learned about many Chinese regional cuisines, and also fell in love. It was a pivotal time in world history and in Julia's life. Now, a second inspiration for today's episode is Julia's support of the International Association of Culinary Professionals, also known as IACP. The IACP Julia Child First Book Award is given in recognition of Julia's commitment to promoting good food writing. Each year, independent judges select the most outstanding cookbook written by a first-time author. The Foundation supplements IACP's award with a $5,000 grant to help the author further their career. In the past 5 years, grants have gone to Samin Nosrat for the acclaimed Salt, Fat, Acid, Heat, Naz Daravian for her Persian cookbook, Bottom of the Pot, Chef Johan Gabriesis for Ethiopia, Recipes and Traditions from the Horn of Africa, Claire Saffitz for Dessert Person, and to Christine Sahadi Whalen for her debut cookbook, Flavors of the Sun. To learn more about these authors and their books, you can check out episode 15 with Samin, episode 54 with Naz, episode 111 with Johannes, episode 148 with Claire, and episode 181 with Christine. Joining this impressive group today is Hannah Che. Hannah is a Chinese-American author, writer, and chef. Her first cookbook, The Vegan Chinese Kitchen, Recipes and Modern Stories from a 1,000-Year-Old Tradition, won the 2023 IACP Julia Child First Book Award. It was featured in many media outlets, including the New York Times, the Washington Post, NPR, Eater, South China Morning Post, and Saveur. Hannah was born and raised in Detroit and trained at the Guangzhou Vegetarian Culinary School. Her first cooking job was a wok chef at Din Tai Fung. She went on to work in 13 different restaurant kitchens, including Michelin-starred establishments such as 11 Madison Park, Single Thread, and Alinea. Until her recent relocation to China, Hannah ran a vegan Chinese tasting menu pop-up called Sarong in Portland. Having lived in Shanghai for 3 months, she recently moved to the Yunnan province near Kunming. Welcome to the podcast, Hannah.
Thanks, Todd. I'm so glad to be here.
We're delighted to have you and looking forward to the conversation. So let's start with a bit of background. Did you grow up a vegan, or was there a specific point in your life where you made a big switch?
I did not grow up vegan. I grew up in a Chinese family with parents who are immigrants from China. And most of the food that we ate at home were Northern Chinese home-style dishes that my parents, usually my mom, would prepare. And honestly, growing up, I didn't really think that much about what I was eating. And it was only later on when I was in college that I started learning about animal agriculture and modern day factory farming. And I had this moment, I believe it was my junior year in college. Over summer break, I read a book called Eating Animals by Jonathan Safran Foer. And I was just so shocked and really blown away by a lot of the information that he shared in that book. And I did some research on my own too about just modern day factory farming practices and kind of how most of the meat and animal products that we consume today get from, they're not really from these idyllic farms anymore. And I just started to connect the food that I was eating on a daily basis. And at that point, I was still eating in the college dormitory or college serveries, the cafeterias. And suddenly I realized I have, a personal responsibility in terms of what I consume. And I made that decision, not really considering at that time my cultural background or even the communal aspect of eating. I think at that point I was just I was very much this is this is a personal decision I need to make in order to not feel this cognitive dissonance every time I was eating animal products. And so I just decided, okay, I'm going to go vegan. And it was only later on, working through and that actual decision and what the consequences of it, and also just the joy too of discovering for myself how to cook. It only came after that decision. And for me, it was that turning point where I started thinking about my food, the food I was eating and cooking in a totally different realm, really, from a different perspective. And yeah, so that's been, I think it's been 8 years since then.
So what was your parents' reaction?
I could remember my mom being supportive of it. And I think it's because she also was very aware, even way before me, of kind of just how messed up the food systems in the United States were then. And she has always been very into, she would always purchase turkeys from this local farm that we lived next to. And she would always try to buy organic when she could. And I think she was a very early adopter of, the slow living, kind of being more cognizant of where your food comes from movement. And so she had already known a lot of the information. I was like kind of like just very excitedly sharing with her as if I was teaching her something. So she was like, okay, that's good. Like, that's a good decision. Just make sure, you're getting enough nutrients. And my dad kind of had a very similar, just like kind of a neutral reaction. So yeah, that was kind of, I think I've gotten more pushback from relatives than my actual parents on, just deciding not to eat meat or fish or animal products.
Yeah, no, I think Julia, my understanding, had kind of reaction where she had trouble wrapping her head around people being vegetarian or vegan. I mean, veganism hardly even kind of existed in her day. But I think that was also generational. She was born in 1912. She grew up in a period where meat wasn't necessarily ubiquitously produced in that way. And then she was affluent, so she had more choices to select. I think when she selected meat or poultry, it went more toward taste, like where's it going to taste the best, and that's from the best humanely raised environments. But those were choices she could make, and I think there wasn't nearly as much expose by the time Julia died of these seminal books like Jonathan Foer's or Eric Schlosser's or these documentaries that have really revealed that the food system is more than just industrialized. There are some really, disturbing practices, both in terms of animal welfare and in terms of what goes into our food. And it's particularly like, to your example, you have way less control over sourcing, right, when you're eating at a university as a student, when you're kind of reliant on their commercial food systems, unless you're doing it for yourself. But the chances are food served at that scale and stuff is from the least high welfare environments.
Mm-hmm. And to that point, my parents too, I think growing up, you just ate meat on a different scale. I think nowadays it's not even surprising to eat a little bit of meat or animal products for every meal. But for them, just in the time, the generation they grew up in, also their circumstances growing up in China, you had meat pretty much like mainly for New Year, Chinese New Year. Like that's when they would, slaughter a pig and really enjoy every single part of the pig as well. But growing up, like they would have a palm-sized piece of pork that would last them, and like chopped up in little slivers for vegetable stir fries for an entire week for a whole family. And like that's 3 ounces of pork, and so it's just a very different way of consuming meat, I think, that now in modern time, like especially also in China, I think there has been a lot more pushback, on exactly how much meat do we need to consume, and kind of more considering the environmental implications of that really drastically increased consumption. So yeah, it's been really interesting talking to my parents too about their own relationship to food and to cooking.
Yeah, that's interesting too, because of course there have been some, I don't think scandal is the right word, but big stories where there was a pork shortage in China because of some disease outbreak, and the volume of pork consumed. But of course, that's over one of the world's biggest populations. So would you say that meat consumption, like per person in China, is still much more modest than what Americans might be used to?
I think so. Yeah. And yeah, I did hear about the pork, the food safety scandal too. I believe it was like a couple years ago.
Yeah.
But that actually is the thing that persuaded a lot of people to start eating more plant-based. And even within the vegetarian movement or the vegetarian traditions of China, there have been these stages, I think, and also different, like various movements within China and within their kind of culinary relationship and historical relationship to like vegetarian eating. And at least in the recent years, it's been a lot of like concern about food safety that's motivated more people to eat plant-based.
Interesting. Well, that's a great segue because I wanted to talk to you more about, what prompted your personal move to China and what you either thought you set out to do and has changed, or what you have been pursuing that was your mission. Tell us more about that.
Yeah, so my relationship to China has really changed over the years. I was born in the States, in Michigan, and mostly grew up in like the Midwest. And then I also lived in Pittsburgh for 7 years. So every time I was in China, previously it was with my family, and we would visit every few years just during the summers to primarily just see relatives. And I always treated these visits as kind of, like fun trips where we would eat a lot of food and see relatives that I really didn't know, even grandparents I really was not familiar with. And so we did live in China for 3 years. This was when I was 9 years old. So I think those 3 years really helped me develop a fluency in the language that I was so grateful for later going back to China for culinary school, just being able to understand and read and write basic Mandarin. And having those 3 years also was good in terms of it was a culture shock for me at that point because I was very American. I grew up in suburban America. And so just living in Shenzhen and close to Guangzhou for that period of time really changed to, I think, my relationship to my Chinese culture. And so when I made the choice in 2019 to go back on my own, it was for a very clear purpose. I was researching at that point the vegan Chinese kitchen, and I had realized that I really knew very little about Chinese cooking beyond the personal connection I had with the food, just what I ate growing up. And I wanted a more rigorous education on it. And so I thought, well, the only way to really learn about Chinese food, apart from, what you can find on the internet, is to just move to China. And I was lucky enough to find this vegetarian culinary school. They had just opened in 2016, and I just connected with them, and I had a phone call with them, sent in my application, and decided at that point, I just graduated from my master's degree from grad school. And I was like, I'm going to go all into writing this cookbook. I booked a one-way ticket. I packed a luggage, and then I just landed in Guangzhou. And so I stayed there for a few months. I completed the program, and that was actually right before COVID. So it was very fortunate timing-wise because that was the last class, our class for the professional training program, before they paused for, I believe, 2 years because of COVID.
Oh my, wow. Yeah, I was following that when you said 19. I was like, okay, when is COVID? Wow. And so, and is that what prompted you did you come back to the States then because of COVID, or you were coming back anyway for?
At that point, I felt like I still hadn't learned enough and still hadn't really immersed myself enough in the culture. And so right when COVID happened, I decided very spontaneously to go to Taiwan, because I had heard that because of the large Buddhist population living there, and all the indigenous traditions that they had, that there were a lot of vegetarians living in Taiwan, and there really that was kind of the hub for even just newer, a lot of younger vegetarian brands or restaurants. And also you had that rich tradition still existing there of the Buddhist vegetarianism. And so I decided, I'm going to go visit Taiwan. And then once I landed in Taiwan, the borders closed. And so I couldn't really go back to China at that point. And I loved Taipei. I was in Taipei. I loved Taiwan so much that I just decided, I think I'm going to stay here. they had COVID really under control at that point. I think it was like record-breaking, like low numbers of cases. And I was looking at what was happening in the US and I was like, I think I'm going to stay here. So I ended up living in Taipei for a year, and I was writing my book, continuing to work on the manuscript at that point. I was teaching English. In order to stay in the country, I had to have a work visa. And so I spent a year in Taipei, and then afterwards I needed to shoot the book. I was doing the photography, and at that point I was kind of overwhelmed by the amount of work that I had to do in order to shoot like 100+ recipes. And I had a tiny little kitchen, and my mom suggested at that point, like, why don't you come back to the States and stay with us for the summer and shoot your book? We can help you. I can help you like do the dishes, and your siblings can help you eat all the food. And I thought that was a great idea. So then I left Taipei, but then I was planning to return. But then what happened was they had a COVID spike there, and so their borders closed to foreigners. And I had given up my work visa at that point. So I kind of just decided, okay, I think all the signs are pointing to I should stay in the US for now. And so I finished shooting the book, and then I moved back to Portland, which is where I started really my professional journey with inside, restaurant kitchens and really working in the industry. So yeah, a lot of twists and turns and very kind of unexpected moves. But I think at a point, like every decision did make sense. And I'm glad that it kind of worked out that way. So this time going back to China was after like a couple years in the restaurant industry. I decided to kind of take a break from that and go back to writing. So it's kind of like this circle, like a full circle that brought me back to China this time.
And are you doing specific research for another book, or you're kind of just information gathering and writing about your experiences?
I am doing research for a second book. And I think at the point when I decided to move back to China, I also had a few potential projects for co-writing, like ghostwriting. And so with those two in mind, and just feeling like that same urge back in 2019 that I need to learn more. Like there's so much out there that I felt like I still had to understand and to explore and to really experience and to eat and to, that it was again like the right decision for me to come back here. And this time I think it's less of, I'm going here for a program, and more so of just like I'm trying to really like live in China and really explore more of the regional cuisines, because back in 2019, I pretty much stayed in Guangzhou. And this time around, I've been traveling to regions and provinces I have never been to, including Yunnan, because my parents are from northern China. And so I was in Harbin, that's the city they grew up in, for a month back in February for Chinese New Year. And then I was in Shanghai for a little bit, but then decided to relocate to Yunnan because of just like the amazing biodiversity and also just the culinary depth and richness of this place.
Wow. Well, let's talk more about that in a bit, but I definitely want to talk more about your cookbook. So we're going to take a short break, and when we come back, we'll be back to talk more with Hannah Zhe about her IACP Julia Child First Book Award-winning cookbook, The Vegan Chinese Kitchen. Stay with us. The 2024 Taste of Santa Barbara is coming up May 13th to 19th. Go to sbce.events to check out the full lineup and to buy tickets. Follow at SB Culinary Experience on Instagram for the latest news and event updates.
Gather your friends and family at the second annual Catskill Cuisine Festival, presented by the Sullivan Catskills Visitors Association, Bethel Woods Center for the Arts, and Resorts World Catskills. Mark your calendars for a flavor-packed weekend from May 10th to May 12th. Experience the fusion of phenomenal food and electrifying entertainment. Rub shoulders with your favorite Food Network personalities, including Andrew Zimmern, Michael Simon, Scott Conant, Marcus Samuelson, Jeffrey Zakarian, Anne Burrell, Melba Wilson, and distinguished international chefs by LaBelle Farms. Kick off the festivities with Friday's star-studded golf tournament and evening reception. Saturday heats up with free tastings, thrilling live demos, music, and family activities, culminating with a gourmet dinner hosted by celebrity chefs. And on Sunday, celebrate Mother's Day with a special celebrity-curated brunch. Tickets for this celebration are selling like hotcakes. Visit Catskill-cuisine.com to grab your pass for this unforgettable weekend in the picturesque Catskills. See you there!
Welcome back. We're talking to food writer and chef Hannah Che about her IACP Julia Child first book, award-winning cookbook, The Vegan Chinese Kitchen. So, Hannah, you were telling us, about your experience becoming vegan and exploring Chinese food traditions, particularly vegetarian ones. But could you tell us more about this kind of concept? Because I think it's really interesting and not well known by Westerners, and maybe not even that well known by everybody. But what is this 1,000-year-old tradition that you're referring to?
So the 1,000-year tradition, it's not exactly 1,000 years. I think that was just like a really nice summary, a way to put it in the subtitle of the cookbook. But it's a tradition, several traditions actually, spanning, I'd say 3,000 years at this point. And vegetarian eating in China kind of can be divided into 3 categories. One of them is what I call Fomen Sushi. So that's kind of the Buddhist and also Taoist traditions of eating in a way where you, because of karmic retribution and because you want to reduce the amount of suffering in the world, it's a way of eating where people just choose not to kill life, harm life. And so the most kind of the purest form of Buddhist vegetarianism is actually vegan, where they don't consume any animal products, including eggs or dairy. And they also don't eat alliums, which encompass garlic and chives and onions, also because of their religious practices. So that tradition, I believe, is the oldest, and it spread also to Japan and Korea and Vietnam. So a lot of the foods too that were developed in Buddhist temple cooking, such as tofu and tofu skin and the uses of those in preparing mock meats, and gluten or seitan, and kind of mountain yam, or they call it nagaimo in Japan, just using those ingredients to produce these dishes that resembled meat dishes or seafood dishes to serve to temple goers and for visitors and patrons of the temple, but didn't include any animal products. This is a really long and still continuing tradition if you visit any temples in China today. And then the second tradition is the what I call popular vegetarianism, which is basically just plant-based eating in China as a result of the economics of meat production, and just how Chinese cuisine is really centered around vegetables and grains, like rice and even buckwheat and sorghum and millet, and just using vegetables as the main ingredient in stir-fried dishes. And really, even the word for a dish in Chinese is cai, which also means vegetable. And so that was kind of the food that I grew up eating. And I think this was the most exciting category for me because, first of all, they used alliums, and so they used garlic and onions, and so all these flavors were present in these dishes. And each regional cuisine has their own vegetable-based dishes. And there are over 22 provinces in China. And so you have just remarkable variety and like flavor diversity and like different flavor profiles that different regions would apply to cooking vegetables. And I think that's just like the broadest category where I feel like every new city or town or village I visit, I don't even go to vegetarian restaurants at this point. I'll just go to like just any local bin bang cai, they call it, restaurant, where I'll just look at their menu and look for the vegetable dishes. It's usually like the majority actually of the menu. And I'll just try as many different kinds as I can. And I think this is like also just the way that most people eat at home. I'd say in restaurants, like a lot of the times you will find more like meat heavy dishes, but for the most part, like even when I visit friends' homes, you know, the foods that they'll prepare are mostly like I'd say like majority like plant-based, which has been really fun to explore.
Yeah, that's really interesting to hear, because I think it's counterintuitive because, of course, American Chinese restaurants, which are a lot of people's experience with Chinese food, are tend to have meat heavy dishes. So it's eye-opening to think about real Chinese cooking in China and eating as people do it, and that it's actually maybe much more compatible with being vegetarian than people might assume from their exposures, like in the United States.
Oh, and I forgot to mention the third category. So the final one was palace cooking, which is the vegetarian cooking in imperial kitchens over the centuries for banquets and for feasts. And so those three, like home cooking, Buddhist monastery or temple cooking, and then palace cooking, are the three categories that make up that 1,000-year tradition.
And it's interesting to hear you talk about mock meats, because that's also like in European tradition, there was a tradition in France and other places of and England of doing these kind of mock meats. Was the purpose sort of the same? It was for chefs to show their talents to aristocratic and royal audiences, or what was the purpose in palace cooking of having mock meats?
So yes, it was part of just the cuisine in terms of like a very sophisticated approach to cooking vegetarian, because you had like the very home style vegetable dishes that were quite simple. And so for the cooks in the palaces, it was also like a very playful, like imitation cuisine where they wanted to replicate the look and taste of meat for non-vegetarians. But then in the palaces also, many emperors themselves were Buddhists, and so they practiced eating vegetarian on certain days of the month. So Chu-yi, which is the first of the lunar month, and then Shu, which is the 15th, they would abstain from eating meat just in terms of like their own religious practices. And so a lot of the times, if you're serving the emperor, you know, and you want to make sure that even on those specific days, like they have the appearance, you know, like in the taste and the flavors of a feast and like banquet style cooking, which is, you know, that lavish presentation. And so a lot of the traditions came up because of just like the context of cooking for the emperor and for his family, and also for visitors, you know.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I want to make sure we have time to talk about some of the recipes from your book. And, you know, I was thinking about that for many people, if they didn't grow up in a Chinese household or had good exposure to Chinese cooking or been taught it or don't cook with a wok at all, it can, you know, sometimes be intimidating. And then you add veganism to it, which is kind of a whole other layer, especially if what you're familiar with is like Kung Pao chicken. Obviously, what you're saying is historically and in China, it's not as big a separation. But for the Western audience you were writing for, could you give us some example of a couple of the recipes that you're fond of that you think are actually really approachable and easy for a beginner to tackle, that are also kind of representative of what the book is about?
Yes. So the Vegan Chinese Kitchen is actually primarily, I wrote it with this particular audience in mind, of like people who want to eat more vegetables and also want to learn more about like Chinese cooking in general, and aren't really sure like how to approach it. And so most of the recipes, I'd say, are very beginner friendly. And I actually think that cooking vegetables is easier than cooking meat. Like, at least you don't have to, know how to butcher chicken or how to like properly store meat. Like, there's all these different things you have to think about when it comes to cooking meat. And so with vegetables, it's very simple. A lot of the recipes just start off with aromatics. And then you have like very basic seasonings, and then you have just like the main vegetable itself. And I talk about like how to cut the vegetable in order that all the pieces to be consistently sized, so that when you're stir frying, they all cook at generally like the same time. And so I'd say like most of the recipes are beginner friendly, and you can really jump in anywhere. But one of my favorite recipes that I've been cooking a lot recently, just because we're entering like the spring produce season, is a stir-fried broccoli recipe. And for that one, it kind of just highlights the basic cooking technique in Chinese food, where you start off with like a raw ingredient. So like broccoli, you cut it into florets, but instead of just throwing, the raw florets into the wok or the pan that you're stir frying, you're going to blanch it first, and then after draining that blanched broccoli, you then start by blossoming some Sichuan peppercorns and some chilies in the wok. I believe there's also some chopped garlic in there. And then you put in this like blanched vegetable that is already like 70% cooked. And then after like basically a minute or a half of stir frying in the wok, the dish is done. And it just represents for me just how quick wok cooking is, and how easy it is really when you're thinking about what is the best way to eat this vegetable. And I love roasting, and I love like the different preparations for broccoli. But for me, like this one highlights just, like getting the broccoli to that perfect consistency, and then just adding in these seasonings and these aromatics that make it extra delicious, so that each bite is like absolutely perfect in terms of the flavor as well as the texture. And then I'd say like another one, I really like the scallion oil noodle recipe. And it's also just like stupidly simple, I say in the head note, where you just stir fry or frizzle up some scallions, and there's a little soy sauce in there, you have some sesame, and then use this as a topping pretty much for noodles. You can just like boil some noodles, but then you can also eat it on rice. You can also use it on vegetables, like on salads or on blanched vegetables. And then I'd say another one is like a basic tofu recipe is always great to have on hand. And I really like this recipe called fragrant dressed tofu with garlic and basil. You don't actually have to fry the tofu at all. I know that can be challenging for some people thinking about like the water content of the tofu, but this is a blanched tofu dish, and it's really just so simple and just so delicious that I think is like, it's a good starting point for people who may be unfamiliar with tofu or want to eat and explore tofu in like a different way than you typically see like in a restaurant.
Great. That's really helpful. I've got my game plan to start trying some of those dishes. And certainly I think there's such awareness of trying to eat plant-based and having kind of new options of eating the same vegetables in different ways with different flavor profiles is great. And I also think that's one of the advantages of wok cooking is so much faster, so that a lot of the idea of all vegetarian eating is it's more time consuming, especially most vegetables to me taste the best cooked, which means a lot of chopping and frying or dicing or boiling or whatever it is. And using a wok definitely speeds up that process. Are there any, did you put in a few truly expert recipes that are super challenging, or do you feel like they kind of all meet that level of simplicity?
There are a few recipes in there that I don't think they're challenging per se, but it takes practice to really get them down. I say the dumpling and the bun, the baozi recipes are kind of like representative of, certain foods that my mom would be like, okay, I can teach you how to make this. Like, or my dad, he likes making the steamed buns, and you can make it and it'll be delicious the first time, but really like getting down the technique of like pleating the buns and exploring different bun fillings. And there's also a few recipes in there just like for like scallion pancakes or for flatbreads like xiaobing that are a little bit more involved, but I think are very fun and worthwhile to attempt. And so I say like definitely like the baozi, the steamed bun recipes are some of my favorites in there that are a little bit more time consuming, but definitely worth the effort. And then there's also a dish that's one of my favorites. It's called the vegetarian fish in sweet and sour sauce. And this is one of like the more kind of like traditional mock meat inspired dishes in that book, where you take tofu skin and you layer it with sheets of nori, and then you steam it. And after steaming it, you basically have this piece of protein, and you can make it resemble a fish. That's kind of where the title came from, but you can also just shape it like as like a rectangle. But then the technique involved is like you kind of slash it with a knife and then fry it again so that it gets crispy, and then dress it with this really delicious sweet and sour black vinegar based sauce. And this is also one of those dishes that has a few more steps in it, but I think when you really master it, it's kind of like a showstopper dish. I served this for Lunar New Year for my relatives in Harbin this year, and they were all kind of blown away just by like, oh, this is a tofu skin. Like, it's a vegetarian fish that really just stands on its own and is pretty impressive. So I'd suggest that one as well.
That's great. That's a really great primer on the book. So thank you for those really clear explanations and suggestions. So before we move into our last segment, I just wanted to get your thoughts and kind of if you could share what you have been doing or plan to do with the $5,000 grant from the foundation that comes with the IACP Julia Child First Book Award that you received.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the grant has been such a gift. I was very surprised when I heard that there was a grant involved, and I think it's just been incredible for like supporting the research that I've been doing. I think also receiving the award and the grant came at the perfect moment, because I was really wavering between, should I stay, in the restaurant, professional cooking sphere, and that work, which had pretty much like taken up, I say, like most of my time. And at that point I was considering going back to writing, but then not really sure. Like, I also felt very little inspiration because I wanted to explore like a certain subjects in Chinese cooking, but feeling like, oh, I need to go back to China for that, and not really knowing when to make that move. But then also still thinking like, oh, do I want to continue in the restaurant industry? And I think now I'm still very much like on the fence about whether or not I even want to go back to professional cooking, just because of how all consuming it is. And the end goal for that is pretty much to, like have a restaurant. And I think my relationship to that industry has also changed a lot based on like, do I really want to, I've seen so many restaurants, operate and start and also close. And knowing the whole cycle of that and not being as in love with the production and business side of professional cooking as I am with just the creative and just like the actual cooking part of it, for me, has been like some of the factors in the decision. But going back to writing this time has just been so rewarding. And especially like having the grant at that time, I was like, okay, this is a sign, that I should really seriously like go back to writing. And for the last few months, at least since last fall, I've just been delving into kind of what brought me to cooking in the first place, which was exploring Chinese food and just like revisiting a lot of the dishes that I had like maybe tasted before, but kind of really going in depth and really just dedicating myself again to research and making that change also in terms of like my lifestyle. It's been really great just to not have to work until, midnight and like get home at like 1 a.m. every night. And so I think like the timing was just perfect in terms of that, receiving this award. And it's been incredibly supportive for me just in my research process for my second book.
Wow, that's really, really wonderful to hear. That's exactly what the award is designed for. So it's great to have that feedback. All right, we're going to take another break. And when we come back, we'll hear Hannah's Julia moment. Let us know what you think of today's show. Send us an email or a voice memo to contact@juliachildfoundation.org. We'll be right back.
When you flip anything, you just have to have the courage of your convictions, particularly if it's sort of a loose mass like this. Well, that didn't go very well. See, when I flipped it, I didn't have the courage to do it the way I should have. But you can always pick it up, and if you're alone in the kitchen, who is going to see?
From Julia's immortal words, we move into our last segment, which we call the Julia moment. Here is when we ask our guests to share their favorite Julia memory, moment, or how she might have inspired them in their career. Hannah, what's your Julia moment?
So I had a few, but I think I'm going to just talk about one that was particularly inspiring for me, and that was reading Julia's book, My Life in France. And when I read that book, I was actually just starting my own process for my first cookbook and moving back to China, to write this book. And I actually had brought the book with me on the plane, and I was reading it when I was in Guangzhou. I had brought like that book along with a few other like food memoirs, and I really wanted to like get in that space. And so when I read about, just her journey moving to France with her husband, and at that point like attending culinary school too, I felt this odd parallel, and I felt very excited. I was like, oh, I'm doing what Julia did, like really learning about the cuisine and the rules of the cuisine, and kind of like also the traditions of professional cooking, like in that cuisine. And then using that information and turning it into a work of literature that people could learn from, I think really inspired me in my own shaping of the Vegan Chinese Kitchen, and kind of what it stood for is like taking something that might have been unfamiliar to the readers I had in mind, and using my experience as my experiences with the food and the cuisine and turning it into like something instructional. And I also, when I was reading just about like how long it took to write Mastering the Art of French Cooking, like I believe it took like 8 or 9 years to get that
at least
book
9,
out.
yeah.
Yeah. And just how devoted she was to, like every single recipe and testing it, and, just like the uncompromising way that she was like, I'm not going to just put a book out there. And I think especially nowadays, there's so many cookbooks being produced, and sometimes I feel like this pressure to just like be faster, and to just maybe just like I tend to kind of like have this all consuming approach to writing a book, and seeing that in Julia and being like, it's okay to take as much time as you need to put out something that you're truly proud of and that you feel like will kind of stand the test of time. And that's always been my goal really with writing too, is just to never lose also a sense of curiosity and wonder and like inquisitiveness about the food and the dishes that you're exploring. And for me, like just reading that memoir was really inspiring to me. I think I still go back to it sometimes, and just hearing her talk about like just French cooking and like the meals that she's had, I do feel like a similar relationship to Chinese cooking, and that there's so much there, and that even like one person, like for me, I don't think I could ever really it's kind of like a lifetime learning, and also a lifetime like career goal that I have is to just continue exploring the cuisine and then processing that and putting out books in a way that other people can also learn and explore and like grow as a cook and kind of learn alongside me. And so, yeah, I'd say the book for me is definitely a Julia moment that is still ongoing.
No, that's amazing. And then I think listeners won't realize we were supposed to record a little bit early ago before you moved to where you are. And now you're like living near where, I was rereading, which is covered more in one of the biographies of Julia, An Appetite for Life, where they talk more at length about her time in China and how much Kunming was a part of that. And that, at least in An Appetite for Life, they talk about actually that was her first exposure, even before she ever got to France, with food as a tradition, or just that there was something exciting about food. And it hadn't stuck in my mind that actually living in Kunming, which I had to even go back because it's so extensive, but it was only, I think, 6 months, but it really made a huge impression. And so in some ways it was really, that was the start of Julia's interest in food. And then when she got to France, it just blossomed from there.
I can definitely see why it was so kind of momentous and inspiring, because I think Yunnan province, it's a province where, in terms of land area, it's only about like 4% of China's total land mass, but it makes up the kind of the plant species and also animal species in Yunnan. I believe it's around like 51% of China's total. And so just the incredible diversity too of the terrain, like it's right under the Tibetan plateau, but it's incredibly sunny. It's kind of like and high altitude. It reminds me a little bit of like a mix of like California and Colorado, but just like on a way larger scale. You have all of these different minority groups living in Yunnan as well. So it's not just the Han kind of like group, but you also have like the Bai minority, and then the Dai, who are related to actually people of like Thailand and Laos. And then you have the Miao minority, who live close to the Vietnamese border. And then you have obviously like the Tibetans in the north, as well as the Chinese Han group living there. And so there's like this incredible diversity too of food culture and like food preparations and flavors. And adding on to that, just like how much there is in terms of like vegetable diversity and fruits and mushrooms. I can see why it was so inspiring to Julia. And that's kind of like the main reason I'm here as well. I just feel like in China, at least, it's kind of like the Wild West of biodiversity and food traditions. And so I actually like flew into Kunming and I took the train to Dali, which is the city I'm living in now. And learning about Julia's also stay in Kunming was pretty funny and I've been very inspired by just like the amount of grilled foods and like raw vegetable salads in Yunnan, because those are two traditions that are not as like kind of typical Chinese. And so just seeing the differences in like the way they prepare foods and also like the varieties of tofu here has been very inspiring.
That's great. I love the full circleness of it, especially this sort of serendipitous full circle. So Hannah, thank you so much for joining us today.
Yeah, this was so much fun. Thanks for having me.
Our pleasure. Thanks everyone for listening. The cookbook is The Vegan Chinese Kitchen, Recipes and Modern Stories from a 1,000-Year-Old Tradition by Hannah Che, published by our friends at Clarkson Potter in 2022. Ask or search for it at your favorite bookseller. For more from Hannah, check out theplantbasedwok.com, where you'll find more recipes, links to her Little Bean Substack, and to her social media. For more episodes of Inside Julia's Kitchen, on juliachildfoundation.org, heritageradionetwork.org, or wherever you get your podcasts. Please follow at Julia Child on Facebook and at Julia Child Foundation on Instagram and Threads for our latest news. I'm at T. Shulkin on Instagram and also on Threads. The Julia Child audio clip from The French Chef is used with permission from our friends at GBH. Thanks to my co-producer of the Foundation, Lauren Salkeld, and our sound engineer is Liam Werner. Our theme song is New French Horn by Novi Valtorni. We look forward to bringing you back into the Foundation's world next time on Inside Julia's Kitchen. Inside Julia's Kitchen is powered by Simplecast. Thanks for listening to Heritage Radio Network, food radio supported by you. Keep in touch at heritageradionetwork.org/subscribe.
I want to tell you about a new podcast called Amuse News. Publishing multiple days a week, Amuse News is your source for food news, interviews from around the food world, and more. On the show, we'll be engaging with food storytellers, from chefs to advocates to people working in the field, and many more. Find Amuse News wherever you get your podcasts. Amuse News is a destination for everyone who's looking for a new, insightful look into the world of food.